And last but not least, we are going to talk about adaptations with just like a touch of evolution in there, and ecological succession. So what happens to ecosystems after they've been disturbed? Again, here are your learning objectives to take a look at later. Hopefully natural selection and, really basic evolutionary stuff is stuff that you saw in biology, but just to review it really quickly, is that individuals with characteristics that are advantageous or more fit in their environment will live to reproduce and pass those characteristics along to their offspring. And so over long periods of time, right, certain characteristics will evolve to help those organisms live in their environment. And so remember, it's not like the best is going or the strongest survives. It's the most fit, right? So like as you see here, like short term, right? You have like the little mouse. White is not better over the gray mouse, except for the fact that the gray mouse is more fit to survive in their environment. And so you see number 3, after the little hawk came in, you have these gray mice, and the gray mice are the ones that are left to reproduce, and so therefore you're going to have more gray mice. My thing about natural selection is always like, if you're dead, you can't have babies. And if you can't have babies, then your genes don't get passed on. And so therefore your characteristics won't get passed on. And that's really the basis of evolution. But if you look at this little graph in the left-hand corner, right, there are a couple ways that natural selection can play out. And so the way that this graph is set up, you have time, so generation-wise, like let's call it generation 1, 2, and 3, right underneath each other. But it's probably more than just 3 generations. We're looking at like hundreds of generations, right? But it's over time. And so it could play out in a couple ways. One, the organism could become a specialist. So on the left in green there, the range of tolerance and their niche actually gets more narrow. Another way is that the species could change. So instead of needing one thing, it could slowly move over so that its needs are in a different niche. And then also in disruptive selection, what happens is that you have speciation. So two species are made really from one ancestor. And so over time, with enough natural selection, they will separate as a species. And ultimately, if we brought them back together, they wouldn't be able to interbreed and have fertile offspring, which is the definition of a species. So, when environmental changes and disruption come along, organisms are either going to do one of 3 things. They're going to move, adapt, or die. So we just talked about organisms adapting, but here on the bottom left, this is actually due to climate change, is that these organisms are shifting their range. So as it's becoming warmer further up in latitude, those organisms are actually moving their range up in higher latitudes to meet the temperatures that they need. So they're migrating. And so it could be, a short-term migration if it's some sort of short-term disruption. But in climate change, right, it's a long-term disruption. And so they're going to migrate for the long term. Now, organisms could die, right? And so that's where we get our, what's happening now with climate change is our 6th extinction, and organisms are not able to adapt fast enough to climate change. They can't evolve that quickly, because evolution takes a really long time and climate change is actually happening pretty fast. So I think that that's the main reason why we're seeing a lot of organisms starting to die off. So finally, once that ecosystem has been disrupted, what happens after the fact? And so here, if you read the essential knowledge points on the bottom there, it says indicator species. I already covered that earlier in the PowerPoint, so I'm not going to be covering that in this little topic section of the PowerPoint here, but you already know what it is, so there you go. So ecological succession is the replacement of one group of species by another group over time. So if you start in the beginning, each successive stage is supported by the one before it. So, right, if you look in the picture below, you start with nothing at bare rock. You have pioneer organisms coming in, creating that soil that then the herb stage can grow into, which ultimately, right, that vegetation dies and decomposes and adds nutrients into the soil, which then can go to the scrub stage, right, and support more. And so each stage is supporting the one after it. And as we go through that, right, your net primary productivity is increasing as you go further into succession, as is your biomass and your species richness. So all of that is going to change as you go through succession. There are two kinds of succession. The first one is primary succession, just like the picture that you saw on the last slide. Primary succession comes from nothing, and I mean bare rock. And so this happens if there's a volcanic eruption. So you end up with, lava that has flowed over the area and has hardened, and you end up with this hard volcanic rock. Or another way that this can come about is when a glacier retreats, it actually scrapes the rocks underneath it and it scrapes it bare. So there's no soil. So the pioneer species are the first species to come in, right? They're pioneers. They're the first. Anyway, right? The pioneer species are lichens. So lichens, if you look outside on the tree, they're like these, they look like little colorful patches of, I don't know, I guess you would probably think that they're fungus or something. And you're partially right. They're partially fungus. It's actually a symbiotic organism to get two species together of algae and fungus together. But anyway, lichens come in and through their processes, they're actually breaking down the rock to create soil. And with that soil, you actually get these small plants that can come in, and they're supported by that small amount of soil that's there. And like I said before, they die and they decompose, adding nutrients, which allows for larger and plant organisms that need more resources, and onwards and onwards and onwards. And so until you ultimately get to a climax community, which is a very stable community. The other kind is a secondary succession. So events like a forest fire that you can see there in the picture, but also like clear cutting or slashing and burning, right? But in this case where you're changing the ecosystem, but the soil actually remains. And so secondary succession needs soil. Get that? Okay. But anyway, so the succession, the pioneer species are not the lichens in this case. They're actually those annual plants, right? And so those start to grow to support more and more organisms up until the climax community. And here in the Northeast, almost all of our forest is secondary forest. The old growth forest was cut down a long time ago, I'd say a few hundreds of years ago, to make way for agriculture. And so in that time, I think people realize that maybe the Northeast isn't the best place for major agriculture, right? And they let the forest grow back. And so we see these secondary forests a lot. Why is our soil not good? Well, here, especially in the Northeast, we have what we call glacial till. It's very rocky. I don't know if you've ever dug a hole, but you have these massive rocks in the ground, and it doesn't make for good gardening. There's better cropland out in the Midwest, right? All right, and finally, we have a keystone species, and the keystone species is a species that helps really structure the ecosystem as we're talking about ecosystems coming into a climax community. You end up with usually a species that plays a very important role. And so if you look here on the left, there's that arch there. This is actually where keystone comes from. It's an architectural structure, and the middle piece in the middle is called a keystone. It's what holds the whole arc together. You don't need any kind of mortar or anything. And so here's an example that sharks come in and, you know, they control other lower predator species by eating them, right? Keeping their population under control. And then when you take the shark away, you actually end up with an overpopulation of that predator species. And so the bottom of the food chain really gets grazed down quite a bit. And so you can see that in a couple of things here. The little sea otter, look how cute he is, isn't he cute? Anyway, he eats sea urchins. As you can see, he's having a little meal there on his belly. And those sea urchins eat kelp. And so with sea otters, it keeps those sea urchins in check. And so we have this beautiful kelp forest, right? It's completely, it looks completely different if those sea otters aren't around. And so it's so important to make sure that these otters are in place, because they really do control the sea urchins. Now, some keystone species are ecosystem engineers. Now, not all keystone species are ecosystem engineers, but all ecosystem engineers are keystone species. Anyway, another cute little guy, the beaver, he makes a dam, and that dam creates the entire ecosystem. Without the beavers, there would be no dam, and without the dam, that water wouldn't be there. And so all of the organisms that live there and around there would not be able to survive. Elephants actually trample and bring down a lot of trees, so they create that intermediate disturbance that's necessary for their environment. And coral reefs, of course, are ecosystem engineers because their reefs provide all kinds of habitat for the organisms that live with them.